stories stick with people in a way that information doesn't. They remember being surprised, feeling outraged. They remember having their heart broken. And if memories from reading a story are attached to meaning, to a sense that something important is broken and needs to be fixed, then it's not just a story, it also has a takeaway.
Welcome to the Nieman Storyboard podcast, where we dig into the craft of journalism and storytelling. I'm Mark Armstrong, editor of Nieman Storyboard. This show is brought to you by the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard. You can get updates by signing up for our newsletter. Just go to niemanstoryboard.org to sign up. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, Ken Armstrong. He's a senior editor and narrative coach for global investigations at Bloomberg News. Over his career, he's published award-winning investigative stories for publications including the Chicago Tribune, Seattle Times, the Marshall Project, and ProPublica. He's won or shared in 4 Pulitzer Prizes, including the 2012 Pulitzer for investigative reporting for his Seattle Times series with Michael Behrens, Methadone and the Politics of Pain. In 2016, Armstrong and T. Christian Miller shared a Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting for An Unbelievable Story of Rape, published by the Marshall Project and ProPublica. And in 2023, his ProPublica story with Raquel Rutledge, The Landlord and the Tenant, won a National Magazine Award for feature writing. At Bloomberg, his award-winning work continues as an editor and narrative coach, collaborating with reporting teams around the globe. One of those stories, Trapped, was an illustrated digital narrative about a neurologist in India who is being held under digital arrest as part of an elaborate scam. The story, by Anand R.K., Suparna Sharma, and Natalie Obiko-Pearson, won the 2026 Pulitzer Prize for illustrated reporting and commentary. Armstrong was a 2001 Nieman Fellow. He and I talked about the blending of investigative journalism and storytelling, and how he learned to embrace both elements to make an impact in his work. We talked about the energizing aspects of collaborating with teams of reporters and editors, and in an era of shrinking newsrooms and budgets, we talked about the ways that journalists can still embrace investigative work in their own stories. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Ken Armstrong. Ken Armstrong, thank you again for being here today.
Thanks for having me on, Mark.
We are not related.
We're in the same city, same last name, same field. But no, we're not related.
Yes. But I want to start by saying congratulations to you and your Bloomberg team on the Pulitzer win for illustrated reporting, which went to Anand R.K., Suparna Sharma, and Natalie Obiko-Pearson for the story Trapped, which was published both as an illustrated story and a long-form written narrative. Both amazing. I know that you've worked on stories that have spanned many forms, both text and audio, for example, but what was it like to work on a story that was essentially an illustrated webcomic? How did this all start out?
It was a learning experience, and a delightfully fun one. I have to say, my home right now is filled with stacks of graphic novels I bought last year, including classics like Persepolis to more recently published ones, so I could sort of learn the form and how people manage to do what they do. How it came about is we had an editor at Bloomberg early last year who challenged us to think about different story forms, and in particular, how we might be able to use illustration more effectively to tell stories. And when she made that challenge to us on the investigations team, we happened to have a story in progress that suited the challenge beautifully. Natalie Obiko-Pearson, who is an investigative reporter in our Tokyo office, was working on a story about digital scams in India. And another editor realized that this would be a terrific pairing, that taking the challenge to do an illustrated piece and matching it with Natalie's story was the way to go. The story takes place in the digital realm, in the psychological realm. You're inside the victim's coerced imagination. It's the kind of story that would be difficult to capture in photographs or in video, but when you have the liberty of illustration, it just seemed to suit it because we could get inside the victim's life, head, imagination in a way that would have been difficult in other forms.
Yeah, I notice with the illustrated version, you really zoom in on that narrative, on what's happening in this person's life. Can you tell us a little bit about, what the story actually is and what happened to this woman?
Sure. There is a scam that is prevalent in India. You can also find variations of it in other countries, but it's called digital arrest. And in essence, what happens is someone will get a phone call and say that they're being under investigation for something. Often it's money laundering. And they'll be told that they are essentially out on bail, that if they agree to certain conditions, they don't have to wait in jail while the legal process works its way to a conclusion. So what they do is they agree to turn their phone's camera on themselves 24/7. And they also agree to a number of other conditions that are invasive, manipulative, isolating. They agree to follow all kinds of rules of custody. They agree to answer 500 questions about their life and their personality. They do all of these things because they believe it will save them from being put in jail and that they will just work through the legal system. And at the end of it, they'll be freed. So, the scam is that at some point they're going to be asked to put up money into a special supervisory account, right? And the money will be returned to them if and when they're cleared. Of course, that doesn't happen, right? The movie will then be sent through the crypto world in various types of ways and will, most of it, likely disappear for forever. That is what we were working on. And what we wanted to do was tell the story of one individual case that would allow us to write about a country and its people and about a digital revolution that has occurred in India, the vulnerabilities that revolution introduced. They created what they called an Aadhaar system, which is sort of the equivalent of our Social Security numbers, and it uses biometric identification. They pushed everybody online very quickly, and the system became vulnerable to hackers. And then hackers suddenly had a wealth of individual information about people that they could use to exploit them. That's what we wrote about. We profiled one person in Lucknow, India, a neurologist who was under digital arrest for 8 days. And that's what we profiled in the graphic novel. Then in the print piece, we zoomed out and we told readers about the people on the other side of the phone. And we wove in the country's history, politics, culture, people who straddle the line between exploiter and exploited. It gave us room to roam, whereas the graphic novel was really tight, claustrophobic, quite consistent with the victim experience. Yeah, it's that's what we were going for. We wanted it to feel suffocating because that's the experience of people who are placed under digital arrest.
And was it always planned that way, that you were going to take different tacks with the written piece and the illustrated, or is it just as it came together, you realized sort of illustrated has a very specific strength, whereas written pieces let you zoom all over the world?
Yeah, it was designed that way. We weren't always certain of the order. And, as we were rolling along, we realized it made the most sense to do the illustrated story first because it's tight, and then zoom out in the print piece. With the illustrated piece, we really didn't have the luxury to roam, and it wouldn't have really suited the form very well. While we were working on it, we realized we kept taking more and more text out in hopes that the art could tell the story as opposed to words. Then you go to a long print piece, 10,000 words. There you have room to roam. But at the same time, we wanted to make sure it was still told in the form of story and through people. We didn't want it to be dry and sort of, a formulaic system story. We wanted it to be a story about people telling who we could tell a larger story by telling people about their lives.
And what is your role specifically in a story like this? I know there are other editors involved as well and different bureaus and divisions. How does your role take shape for this story and then more broadly at Bloomberg?
It's really ad hoc. My job at Bloomberg is I'm an editor, a reporter, and a narrative coach. The one condition I asked when I took a job at Bloomberg was that I not be a manager. I would be terrible at it. I'd be unhappy. I don't want to supervise anyone. I want to work with people on stories, but I don't want to be writing evaluations or doing any of those other things that I know would just make me miserable. So in this particular case, I was working with Natalie Obiko-Pearson, the reporter in Tokyo. We hired a reporter in India, in Delhi, named Suparna Sharma. And then we hired an artist, Anand RK, who is in Mumbai. We had 5 editors in all working on this. And just to give you an idea of what it's like to be at Bloomberg, we would have to organize meetings. We had people in New York, Chicago, Seattle, Tokyo, Mumbai, and Delhi. No matter when we had a meeting, somebody was up very late or up very early, and we would basically take turns in terms of who got the lousy hour. But we would work together on this. I wrote the initial script, the opening draft for this, because Anand doesn't write stories. He illustrates them. You know, the graphic novels he's done, he's usually working with somebody else. There's a writer named Ram V, who he's worked with on at least a couple of graphic novels. So I wrote a script, which would have text and then suggestions for the images. And then it became a team exercise where we would workshop it. Anand found all kinds of ways to take ideas that I had introduced and elevate them, right? Use his skills to make whatever I had, put in the script, make it 10 times better. As a group, we found ways to sharpen the text, to reduce the amount of language that we needed, to introduce different layers or reveals as we went along. But it was something where I'm almost hesitant to say I wrote the script, because the script changed from my initial draft to what was published because we leaned on everybody else's expertise and their particular skill set.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned you're coming in as an editor, narrative coach, but not as a manager. And I think that's kind of a fascinating point, which is, often in newsrooms, the editor is your manager. And I think it's an interesting distinction about what role an editor plays to a writer that is not a manager, that is more of a coach and someone who's bringing out your best work. Is that what do you find as an editor, it's an advantage to not be the manager?
It changes the dynamic. It changes the relationship. I've spent almost the entirety of my career as a reporter, so it's very easy for me to relate to what reporters are going through because I've been there many times. You've probably talked with other reporters on the podcast, I'm sure you have, who tell you what a head-spinning experience it is. You've been through it yourself, right? There are few things that are more likely to bring out every kind of anxiety that we have than doing investigative reporting in the form of long-form storytelling, right? Every doubt, every question, we question everything. Is this still a story? Why did I ever start this? Why did I go into journalism? Why didn't I go into architecture? What am I doing? Will this ever end? All of those questions come into play. And since I've had all those questions, I think it's just easier for me to relate to what reporters are going through at particular points in the process and perhaps help, encourage, support, whatever might be needed at any given time. And it's easier to do that if you're not the supervisor, but you're a colleague. You don't find many people who have editor as part of their job title who aren't managers. But for me, it was critical. I'd been a reporter for 40 years. I still have reporter in my title, even though I haven't done any reporting in a couple of years. It works for me.
And what is your role like? You mentioned narrative coach, I'm sure also investigative coach as well. Like, where do you bring your strengths when you come to a place like Bloomberg, which you've worked in traditional newsrooms, you've worked for nonprofits, Chicago Tribune, Seattle Times, Marshall Project, ProPublica, and now Bloomberg, which is a very different type of media company. So where do you see your unique skill set, coming to work with this group of reporters?
I think the background you just described is what helps me most. I've worked in different settings. I've worked in different forms. And if I'm talking with a reporter at Bloomberg, particularly a reporter who's been there a long time, it can be helpful just to talk about other possibilities, both in the reporting and the writing. And that's really what they wanted me to do when they hired me. And they have been true to their word throughout. They asked me to not think about stories that Bloomberg would be expected to do, or that I think Bloomberg would want to do, but to think about stories more broadly. And, the graphic novel is an example of that. I don't think most people would associate Bloomberg News with graphic novels. It feels like a disconnect. But Bloomberg has become extraordinarily ambitious and inventive in the work that it does. And it's a lot of fun being part of that. So for me, I when I work with people, I tell them I can be as involved as they want, or if they just want to have a conversation at a particular moment about reporting possibilities, or if they just need to brainstorm with someone about anything, about structure, if they're having writer's block and they want to talk about that. It's kind of an ad hoc job where I can come in at different times on different stories and help, if I can, in any number of different ways.
Now, there's another 2024 story that you worked on about the black market for selling human eggs and the teenage girls being lured to sell their eggs. 8 reporters, possibly more, worked on this story. It was also turned into a podcast series as well. So can you tell me about that story, how that came together, and what it's like to have maybe larger number of reporters working on one story all at the same time?
This story, The Egg, had 8 reporters plus a number of contributors. It involved reporting from 5 different continents. It had 4 different storylines that were threaded through it. I'm getting to learn about what it's like to report in Varanasi or in Greece or in Australia or South America. And then we're taking these different storylines and doing a weave with expository sections stitched in, right, in between them. The story was about private equity, commodification, data from ICMART, which, if I'm remembering, was something like International Consortium for Marketing or Monitoring Assisted Reproductive Technologies. Just rolls off the tongue, right? Who doesn't want to read about commodification, private equity, and data from ICMART? The challenge was to turn that into a story. And we did that by finding people who would take us to different parts of the world who were having very different circumstances. You've got a teenager in India who was lured into selling her eggs. You have a model in Argentina who's paid $35,000 for her eggs because her genetic makeup is so prized. You have a mother in Greece who's informed that her eggs have been stolen. And you have women in Taiwan who are coming and selling their eggs in the United States at considerable risk. We have contrasts to work with. We have good storylines. We have one's a mystery, one's a thriller, one is a journey. We had a reporter in South America, Jessica Bryce, who follows the journey of the eggs from donation to the clinic. She is in the lab when the extraction takes place. She's in the warehouse when the eggs are prepared for shipping. She's on the same plane with the eggs when it's shipped from South America to North America. She's in Beverly Hills when the eggs are shipped or delivered to a particular clinic. Her access was extraordinary, and it allowed us to take people along. We're not writing in the abstract, about what's happening in a hospital setting or in a warehouse or at the airport or at the clinic. She's there. And that thread contrasted nicely with the other ones, right? While she's selling her eggs for $35,000, the teenager in India, she may have been as young as 13, was selling her eggs for $180. So by using stories, we were able to get at larger points about this very unusual market. The other thing that we strive to do was to not villainize IVF process. So while we are describing people who are being exploited in this market, we're also describing people who are benefiting from it. Couples that are having children that they otherwise would not be able to have. That was something that was really important to us, was to write about this industry in a way that was fair and not black and white. Because we were writing about markets that were legal, illegal, in a gray area, but a lot of people benefit from IVF. It's essential to them. So we included that in the story as well.
And so all of this reporting in detail is coming in. Is there someone who's running point and putting together the larger structure? Is this a writer or an editor?
Originally, it was going to be 4 different stories. Right. Each of the 4 paths I just described was going to be its own story. When I joined Bloomberg, we decided that it would have more power if we put them together in one piece so that the contrast would be more evident and the ripple effect across borders from a policy change in one country would become more evident. I was working with a brilliant editor, Lauren Etter, at Bloomberg. She and I worked together on the structure with the reporters. We had 4 main writers, one for each of those storylines, and they had timelines that they created. And using those timelines, we were all able to come up with a structure, a way to come in and out of each story. So you have your entry points, your exit points, and your exposition sections. And then the reporters would write to the outline that we had as a group. It would have been very difficult to do otherwise. If we didn't have an outline on the front end, I think it would have become unwieldy and confusing.
Yeah, and you've worked as a reporter on collaborations, both with other reporters and with other outlets as well, going back to Unbelievable Story of Rape as well, T. Christian Miller. What are the things journalists should look out for when they're in a collaboration like that? Do you like it? A. And then what are some tips on how to manage being in the middle of that process?
To question A, I love it. I love being in a collaborative setting. And that's something that I've been doing for most of the last 15 years. A lot of projects with multiple newsrooms, multiple reporters, all kinds of other people who are contributing. Mark, I sometimes think about how lucky I've been in my career, because if you took all of the reporters and editors I've worked with on individual stories and you created a newsroom out of them, I would put that newsroom up against any in the world. I have been that lucky. With Unbelievable, T and I were both working on that story separately. We tripped across each other. T discovered I was working on the story at the same time that he was. Instead of defaulting to the natural impulse, which was to compete, he and his editor, after some convincing, decided to reach out and see if we wanted to work together on it. And I did. I thought that the whole would be better than the individual parts. T and I are different writers. We didn't try to write to the middle or flatten out our language so that we sounded the same. Instead, we leaned in to our stylistic differences while doing the story. T wrote half, I wrote the other half. We worked with brilliant editors throughout who made contributions across the board. Joe Sexton elevated the structure. Bill Keller had the good sense to tell us that our ending was way too long and that we needed to get off the stage, right? So he was like, you got 3,000 words at the end of this. You could just lop them off and everybody would be appreciative. You need to hear those things sometimes from an editor. Kirsten Danis comes in at the very end and she does a precision edit where she removes maybe 1 or 2% of the words. But that's huge, right? Because when you're writing a long story, that was a 12,000 word story, the language needs to be as tight as a banjo string. You cannot waste the reader's time. And so we had people throughout who were contributing. The designers had some brilliant ideas that we incorporated into the piece. So I think beyond yes, I love collaborating. My suggestion is you need to be open to it. Don't fear it. Because in this case, the collaboration went well beyond the Marshall Project, where I was at the time in ProPublica. I was working with This American Life at the very beginning of it, right? Because it was going to be a piece that was going to be in print for the Marshall Project and then a This American Life episode. With This American Life, it's very much a teamwork setting, like I was describing with the graphic novel that we worked on last year. I wrote a script with Robin Semyon, a brilliant producer who was at This American Life at the time. But then you turn it over to a table read and a group edit. Ira Glass called me at the very beginning of this and told me that in his experience, some people who come from the print world embrace that table edit and others run out of the room and never return. And he just wanted me to know what I was in for and if I was willing to go along. And I was. So in addition to all the brilliant editors at the Marshall Project and ProPublica, I'm working with Ira Glass and Robin Semyon and their team. And I hadn't worked in radio before, so I'm learning at every turn. They're coaching me. They're used to working with print newbies, so they have a system in place where they can take all of my awful habits and fix them for me or remind me of them. I had to learn a new way to do interviews. I had to learn how to write in and out of tape. These aren't things that you normally do, in the print world. It was, for me, one of the most rewarding experiences I've ever had. So in terms of collaboration, be open to it. Realize that you're going to learn so much in the process that you can apply in stories down the road. And be nimble, be curious, ask a lot of questions. If you find yourself being too comfortable in whatever news organization you happen to be in, that's a danger sign. And when you collaborate with other newsrooms and other people, that's a good way to get out of your comfort zone and be sure that you are going to be doing different things, different stories in different ways with different people.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned that you and T had different writing styles. How do you think of your own writing style?
Spare. I like to write in a way that is spare. I'm not going to tell you what the weather is unless it really matters in terms of what the action is. I want to tell you what people say, what they do, maybe what they're thinking. If I can get that kind of access that will allow me to say that with some authority. I like long quotes. I like to hear people thinking out loud about how they're going to answer a question. I love scenes. I spend a lot of my time thinking about scenes, dialogue, how to make them work, how to structure them, not necessarily chronologically, so that they tell the story best. And I will tell you what T's writing style is. T is much more cinematic than I am. If somebody's drinking coffee, he's going to find out what kind of coffee. Is it a cappuccino with this and this? He goes out of his way to find all of those details. And in Unbelievable, his writing style matched the story that he was writing, which was a chase, right? It's two police detectives in Colorado who are hunting down a serial rapist. His writing style is very propulsive. You can see it in your mind's eye as you're going through it. My part of the story was much more meditative and reflective about why police in Washington state did not believe a young woman when she reported being raped. And my writing style matched that half of the story. So it was serendipitous in a way. And credit to both news organizations for recognizing that we didn't need to compromise and that the story would be better if T wrote the story the way he writes and I wrote my half of the story in the way that I write, and then we put them side by side, lock them in, and see what we have.
I want to zoom all the way out because I feel like your work occupies two worlds, the world of investigative journalism and the other being narrative nonfiction. And I'm curious how you came to both worlds and what you've learned and what you teach. You teach a lot of this about sort of bringing those worlds together as well, and how people can do it.
To me, my favorite stories sit in between those two worlds. They sit at the bridge that connects them. And I don't want to make it sound like that bridge never existed. John Hersey wrote Hiroshima 80 years ago, right? It was 1946 when he wrote it. So it's not like I have come up with an idea that nobody else had before. Very far from it. And there are people during my career who have done this work at the highest levels. You look at Kate Boo. Today you look at Hannah Dreier. And I could go on in terms of the people who do investigative reporting, but write it with a narrative style. What I found is that stories stick with people in a way that information doesn't. People remember stories. They remember being surprised, feeling outraged. They remember relating to someone or feeling for someone. They remember having their heart broken. And if memories from reading a story are attached to meaning, to a sense that something important is broken and needs to be fixed, then it's not just a story, it also has a takeaway. And to my mind, if a story sits in the middle, it will be remembered and it also can make a difference. And that's what we want. We put a lot of work into our stories, into our reporting. We want it to make a difference. And a story makes it easier for people to give a damn than a bullet point with information. I probably haven't written a bullet point in many years. In fact, I often don't even write a nut graph. I would rather write a story and let the reader understand the takeaway from the story itself. I think that that's more powerful. Often you have to get buy-in from the newsroom and the editors. But, I've been lucky enough to get buy-in on multiple occasions to write very long stories that don't have a nut graph.
Do you remember, and can you share some of your earliest story memories, both on the investigative and narrative, or both?
I started out working at very small newspapers, and I got a sense of community from doing that work. It was fun. So in terms of working professionally, that's my first memory. And I remember how much the stories I was writing about high school sports meant to the people, right? I would get calls. I also remember that working at small papers, if I made a mistake, I was much more likely to learn about it at a small paper than I was at a large paper. If I made a mistake at the Chicago Tribune, I might not necessarily have a reader tell me about it because I think I was viewed as being more distant, inaccessible. Whereas a small town, if you get the name of a street wrong, you're probably going to have your phone ringing or get an email. The first story I remember writing was in Twin Falls, Idaho. I was the night cops reporter there, and I heard that there were two veterinarians in Twin Falls who were basically in a feud. And I went to the sheriff's office and asked them about this. And the most remarkable thing happened. I know it's remarkable in retrospect. I didn't know it was remarkable at the time. The sheriff's deputy brings out two stacks of documents. One is complaints that one veterinarian has filed against the other. The other stack was complaints that that other veterinarian had filed against the first. These were pending cases. This was an open investigation. I was not entitled to see those records. I didn't know that. He didn't know that. Thank goodness. Otherwise, I would have never seen them. And then both veterinarians agreed to talk to me. So I had each of their accounts and their suspicions about the other, and they were accusing each other of awful things, terrible things, poisoning a horse, shooting a dog. For me, it was where I think my love of public records can be traced. Seeing those two stacks of documents, all the details that were in them, and how it would allow me to tell a story side by side. I don't think I told that story particularly artfully. I was young, I was learning, but it's memorable to me because of seeing all of those records and then having each of the veterinarians agree to talk to me and then being able to write a piece that was really counterintuitive. We do not think of veterinarians as mistreating animals. And the idea that they were each accusing the other of hurting or killing animals out of this feud was really striking. That's kind of an understatement, but that story stands out to me. In terms of narrative, when I went to the Seattle Times, I started doing more narrative, and I had brilliant editors there. The first project I worked on was with your predecessor, Nieman Storyboard, Jackie Banaszynski. She taught me so much about narrative. Then my editor was Jim Neff. Jim Neff was brilliant. He understood structure at a level that I did not, and he would walk me through it. He was one of the first editors, perhaps the first editor I ever had, who, when I would turn in a long story, would find something that I told halfway through and say, why are you giving this away so quickly? Why don't you reserve that and tell it 3/4 of the way down? Every other editor is telling you the opposite, right? There's like, move it up, move it up. Readers are impatient. They're busy. They don't have time for this. Jim had an understanding that the delayed reveal would have more power. And if you really thought about what you told readers when, the story would be so much richer for it. So when I went to the Seattle Times, I really leaned into investigative reporting as a narrative. Seattle Times has a storied investigative team. Historically, so many phenomenal people have come through there. And with the editors there, Dave Boardman, Kathy Best, Suki Dardarian, they embraced this. They were willing to take chances and tell stories in different ways. So they really encouraged me to be adventurous in terms of writing stories.
Now, we get a lot into narrative nonfiction, obviously, with the Storyboard podcast, but for the journalists in our audience who have not done as much investigative journalism, I think there are many where the idea can feel daunting or something that can only happen with sort of specialized institutional support or in the right newsroom. So I'm wondering if you could help give us some advice for those who want to explore it more deeply and even understand kind of what's achievable as a solo journalist.
I get that question fairly frequently when I talk to journalism classes or to individual students, and I struggle with it because the journalism world right now is so different from when I started out. And I always worry that I'm going to be giving advice that is so terribly antiquated that it will be worse than of no use. It will be harmful to people. But with that caveat, I do think that there are things that young reporters, even without institutional support, can lean into. You don't need institutional backing to file a public records request. The more frequently you do that, the more comfortable you become doing that, the more you understand that so many things are reduced to writing or are in audio or in video if we learn how to ask for it and we learn the different wrinkles of various public records laws. So the sooner you get into the practice of filing public records requests, the better off you will be. You don't need institutional backing to connect dots, to do the kind of research where you are making connections that somehow other people have not made. And, you need to be analytical. You need to be comfortable with deep research. You need to become, a good writer, a clear writer. All of those things will pay off. I'm going to be the ultimate hypocrite, and I often recommend that reporters be bilingual or multilingual. I am neither. That has been an enduring source of regret in my career. I have had a number of stories where I just wasn't equipped or the best equipped to do them because of my lack of language skills. I like to tell young reporters that there are fewer jobs in journalism now, but somewhat counterintuitively, there can be more opportunities. When I was starting out, we were sort of pigeonholed. You were a newspaper reporter. You were a magazine reporter. You were in TV. You were in radio. Now you can cross over and come back between. You can play in all of those platforms now in a way that you couldn't when I was young. So if you're nimble and you become comfortable and you learn the differences between what makes a good audio piece versus what makes a good print piece versus a graphic novel. How do you do a graphic novel? You become more attractive to hirers. But more importantly, you become a better storyteller and a better reporter because, one of the things that we all encounter is reporters who want to write a narrative and they come to you with the completed story and you have to tell them, I'm sorry, you didn't report it as a narrative. You can't simply take what's in your notebook that you reported as a traditional piece and now write it as a narrative. So I think the more you try different forms early on, the more you'll grow. Frankly, the more rewarding you'll find the job to be. And one last thing, which I found that helped me early in my career, and I think it would still apply to today. I went to law school when I was young and dropped out, but I stayed in for 1 year. And then I worked as a summer associate at a law firm. And during that 1 year, I learned how to do legal research. That gave me an advantage over other reporters. I knew how to use Lexis and Westlaw. I knew how to do Boolean searches, in case law. It allowed me to do a lot of reporting, particularly at the Chicago Tribune, that other reporters would have struggled with. I think if you're young and you find an area where you can develop expertise that other people don't have, and it's on a subject that fascinates you to no end, you're off and running. Because while you're being nimble, you also have a very specific kind of expertise that you're going to continue to expand on because you're interested in it. And I think that if you pick your subject well, if you try to look out 10, 15, 20 years from now, you can even make a career out of reporting in a particular subject if that's what you want to do. The other thing I tell young journalists is the work is hard. It's stressful. And when I was younger, journalists were really self-righteous, and we sort of viewed people who left journalism as being weak. When we were at our most judgmental and most self-righteous, we would say, they couldn't cut it. That's nonsense. It's worse than nonsense. There is no shame whatsoever in giving journalism a spin and deciding it's not for you, because you will leave with experiences that you will remember forever and with skills that a lot of other people don't have.
Absolutely. Great points. One other thing that strikes me when I go to your website, the very first link I see is for people to send you story tips. Is that a skill that is sort of baked into your being, that kind of constant search for the next story and how you operate each day?
I wish I could tell you yes to when you say each day. But now that I've been in the editing world for a couple of years, that muscle is, I don't know that I'm using it every day, though I did use it just a couple of days ago. I was having a conversation with a family member who told me something which I recognized immediately could be a great story. And I passed it along to a reporter at Bloomberg. And I won't be surprised if that's a story that I'll be sending you a link to in 6 to 8 months. If things go well, I always welcome story tips. Any reporter will tell you that 9/10 of what you get, you're probably not going to pursue. It may be more than 9/10. It may be 95 out of 100. But if you make the mistake of assuming that they will all be things that are going to go into the discard pile, you're going to miss the one that comes in, which will lead to something maybe special. And you just want to have your mind open, your ears open, your eyes open to those tips that come in and that can lend themselves to a story that you've never done before.
Ken, this has been wonderful. Thank you again for being here.
Well, thanks, Mark. This has been fun.
Thank you again to Ken, and thanks to all of you for listening. If you like what we're doing with Nieman Storyboard, leave us a written review and a rating in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also share this podcast with a friend. We'll see you soon.